Now, before I get into this, I do have to warn you that there will obviously be huge spoilers for The Last Jedi, so if you haven't seen it yet, do yourself a favor and check it out first before watching this video. You've waited 2 years for this movie, you can wait another few more hours, days, or whatever. So please click away now if you haven't seen the movie yet. This will be your one and only warning. And with that out of the way, let me start by saying that I've seen the movie twice now and that I did like it quite a bit, especially after seeing it the second time. Though I can't say I absolutely loved it, and I don't think it was the most amazing movie ever. In fact, I'm not sure what score I'd give it or how I'd rank it right now against the other movies. That kind of assessment will come in time and after a couple more viewings. But I can safely say it's not the best Star Wars movie in my opinion, and it's certainly not the worst. And one thing I was absolutely wrong about concerning my predictions about this movie is that it would change Star Wars, that Disney would do something to start to make it their own and to distinguish it from what Lucas had originally created. Not only was that not the case, it was the exact opposite. This movie tried to take Star Wars back to its roots, back to what it was in the days of the original trilogy, and that is a fun story about intriguing characters that doesn't get bogged down by the details. Because what surprised me the most about this movie was just how simple and straightforward the story was, and that's coming from a guy who's made several videos trying to warn people not to get too attached to elaborate theories because they're never going to happen. So when I say I was surprised by the simplicity and easy to follow nature of the story, I'd imagine there are probably some disappointed fans out there right now who thought we were in for a whole new level of complexity in our Star Wars, but that just wasn't meant to be. Rian Johnson created a movie that, dare I say, anyone can enjoy no matter how much or how little you know about Star Wars. Not one that would go over the heads of 99% of the viewers and only appeal to the hardcore fans. And just how simple was this story? Well, the only explanation we got for Rey's powers is she was meant to be a counterbalance to Kylo Ren, a light to his darkness. She was, and I'm sure many are disappointed right now, no one. Her parents were deadbeats who sold her off for drinking money and are now buried in a pauper's grave somewhere on Jakku, which is what I'd been predicting all along. But of course, it doesn't explain that scene in Rey's Force vision during The Force Awakens when someone leaves her behind. Because how do dead parents leave their child behind like that? And Rey was screaming for them to come back, so clearly she cared about whoever was on that ship. So that could mean Kylo Ren lied to her, or told her a truth from a certain point of view, and knows who her parents truly are, but that is a debate for another video, I think. Another thing we learned about, which would also have a very simple explanation, is the bond between Rey and Kylo Ren, and that bond was put there by Snoke himself, and I'll get more into Snoke in a minute, as a way to use Kylo Ren's weakness to draw Rey in and destroy her, though it didn't exactly go as he planned. And the fact that all three of them, Rey, Kylo Ren, and Snoke, all foreseen what was going to happen in that final confrontation, but interpreted it in different ways, plays into a common theme in Star Wars, that visions are difficult to understand, and that the future is always in motion. And there were also some questions left over from The Force Awakens that this bond may have helped explain, and that is how Rey was able to push back into Kylo Ren's mind during the interrogation scene, and how she used a Jedi mind trick, since we now know she's never had any type of Jedi training, and that's because, presumably, she picked it out of Kylo's mind, which is a theory I'd heard from many people. And I did like the connection between Rey and Kylo Ren. I liked the version of Reylo that they gave us. These were two lonely souls reaching out to each other, trying to save each other. The problem is, they both had different ideas on how to save the other. Rey thought that she could bring Ben Solo back to the light, and Kylo thought he could turn her to the dark side. In the scene where Kylo Ren kills Snoke after Snoke himself prophesizes that Kylo would activate a saber and kill his true enemy, was unexpected and well done. Again, it played in on how difficult it is to truly foresee the future, and was the closest thing we got to a mind-blowing twist in this movie. As for Snoke himself, again, it was kept very simple, and he really was the Emperor 2.0, and what I mean by that is, just like we learned nothing about the Emperor in the original trilogy, we learned nothing about Snoke in this trilogy, at least thus far, other than the fact that he was clearly very powerful, and ultimately had trouble foreseeing his end, just like Palpatine did. And this is where some of my problems with this movie start to come in, because just where had he been? Where had Snoke been hiding for all those years during Palpatine's reign over the galaxy? Did Palpatine know about him or not? Was he the dark side power he felt in the Aftermath book series? And if he's not a Sith, what is he and who trained him? These are all questions that need to be answered and likely will in the other sources of canon. But thankfully, they weren't needed to make this movie work because this movie wasn't about Snoke. And getting into his backstory would have complicated this movie in a way that it really didn't need to be. And then there's of course Luke Skywalker and the way he was handled in this movie. And as you may know, he's always been and always will be my favorite character. And my biggest concern going into The Last Jedi was what had become of him in the past 30 years since the end of Return of the Jedi, because the trailers had portrayed him as a broken man who had given up on his family and friends, his true strengths. But he didn't give up on them. Instead, he had given up on himself and placed a good portion of the blame on the Jedi, which was an order he truly did feel needed to end. And how do I feel about that? Well, it worked for the story in the movie, and honestly, that's what's important here. They wanted to tell a story about this man that I think most of us could relate to. A story about a man who had lost faith in himself because he had failed those he cares about. Again, something a lot of us can relate to. But as Yoda would tell him, in one of my favorite scenes of the movie, is that failure is our greatest teacher. And I think that was the last lesson he had to learn before Luke could let go and become a Force ghost, which he of course did at the end of this movie. But not before he showed how powerful he was by projecting himself onto Crate to inspire the Resistance and to confront his nephew, at which point he told Kylo Ren that he had essentially given up on him, which is a bit odd considering this is the guy who had never given up on Darth Vader. And was this the type of display of power we all wanted to see out of Luke? Well, probably not. I dare say most of us wanted the real Luke Skywalker to walk out on that salt flat of Crate and dismantle the entire First Order attack force with a few waves of the hand. But this movie didn't turn Force users into superheroes, which I was afraid it might. Another thing it didn't do is expand on the Force at all. There was no shocking reveal, which was another one of my predictions that was dead wrong. Once again, we got another basic explanation of the Force from Luke to Rey, which in some ways hinted that balance within the Force is equal parts dark to light, and in others implied that the Force simply is the balance. As for it being so much bigger, which the first trailer told us it was, well, no, that's not really the case. It seems to be the same old vaguely explained Force we've known and loved for 40 years now, and that is something that, somehow, both makes me happy and disappointed at the same time. And another thing that disappointed me about this movie is that we learn the balance didn't last very long in the Force, despite the fact that that's exactly what the first 6 movies of the saga were about, achieving a balance. And we do know it was in balance because Luke says as much, and that there was a balance until Ben Solo, with his Skywalker blood, came along. And what that basically says to me, or starts to imply, is that there was somehow balance even though Snoke was out there somewhere doing his thing, whatever that might have been. Which means Snoke almost seems like some sort of necessary evil, or part of the dark side that needs to exist and act as some type of anchor, for lack of a better way of putting it, to keep the scales in balance. And this is further backed up by what Snoke himself said, that darkness rises and light rises to meet it, which means that no matter what, this battle, which goes back to what Maz Kanata said in The Force Awakens, is always going to be waged and just take different forms. That lasting balance is impossible to achieve, which really kind of takes the idea of the prophecy of the Chosen One, introduced in the prequels of course, and makes it feel a little irrelevant. Because why make this prophecy about a balance that can never be maintained pretty much no matter what, which to me is what Snoke implied, that one side is always going to be more powerful and the other is always going to come about to challenge it. And then when you factor in that we witnessed the birth of a new rebellion at the end of this movie, keeping in mind it's only been 30 years since the last rebellion was victorious, well, that was a bit depressing to me. It means that happy ending at the end of Return of the Jedi, where the Force was in balance and the galaxy was at peace after those rebels won, is completely gone now. It feels like all the struggle we witnessed in the original trilogy and that setup in the prequel trilogy was for naught. And yes, of course, I understand things had to go awry in the galaxy in order for there to be a sequel trilogy to be made, but I do have to question if maybe there was a somewhat different direction for this trilogy to take. And yes, I did like The Last Jedi. As I said, I liked it quite a bit, especially after the second time I saw it. It had that old Star Wars feel to it, but that was also part of the problem. It almost tried too hard to be what Star Wars used to be, and I know I sound like the most difficult fan in the world right now, and maybe I am, But something tells me that the reason Rian Johnson has already been signed on to make a brand new trilogy, and why they've announced it already, is because they realize that whatever comes next has to be different. That a vast majority of people are going to probably love this sequel trilogy because it does feel like old Star Wars. But that it's also time for the Skywalker saga to end, and for us to explore new aspects of Star Wars. And they want to let us know that that is indeed coming, but this won't be it. And something to keep in mind right now is that Kylo Ren is the last Skywalker. Yes, Leia is technically still alive, but we have to figure she does not survive past Episode 9, assuming she'll even be in it. And speaking of Leia, I don't know how I feel about that scene where she used the Force to save herself after being ejected out into the vacuum of space. A part of me thought, well, okay, if she's got Skywalker blood running through her veins, she should, in theory, be about as powerful as Luke or her son Ben. So maybe, just like with Rey, if in the right type of life or death circumstance, you close your eyes, you can really just let the Force in and have it guide you without ever having been trained. Other than that, I thought Leia was handled perfectly in this movie, and it only made the passing of Carrie Fisher break my heart even more. I thought her basically being shown passing the torch to Poe as the new leader of the rebellion was a great story arc for both characters, and I also thought the scene between her and Luke was one of the best in Star Wars history. That scene needed to happen, and I'm so glad it did. As for Finn, I love what they did with his character in this movie. He had a great story arc, and he's come a long way from the guy who just wanted to run from the First Order. And now we saw he was willing to sacrifice himself to try and stop them, which is what I always thought this character would end up being. A crucial part in defeating the First Order, not a Jedi in waiting. I also liked his budding relationship with Rose, and she was another character I thought was great in this movie. And it was hard to tell what Rey was thinking when she saw those two together at the end. Then there's Benicio del Toro's character, also known as DJ, who was essentially the new Lando. And again, he was another great new character. Just like with The Force Awakens, I felt the strength of this movie was with the characters. Other than two glaring exceptions, those being Maz Kanata and Phasma, who were barely in the movie and felt like throwaway characters, especially Phasma. So again, overall, I liked this movie for what it was, a Star Wars movie, one intended for fans of all ages and knowledge levels. And its place in the saga, and how it's impacted the other movies, is no doubt something I'll delve far more into in future videos. Just like I'll no doubt delve deeper into some of the characters I just skimmed over here, and some of the questions we were left with, of course, though this movie left us with far fewer questions than The Force Awakens did. In fact, this movie felt like it had a legitimate ending, unlike The Force Awakens. Mostly though, I just wanted to get my initial thoughts out there and to give you all a forum to start sharing your thoughts so we can all hopefully talk some Star Wars. So please leave your comments below and tell me what you thought of this movie, what you liked, what you didn't like, and what you'd like for us all to talk about in future videos. But for now, thanks for watching.